Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my December wrap up. Today I'm going to be talking about the things that I read in December. So hello, Happy New Year. It is 2026, which feels very ridiculous, but there we go. I also feel like I am getting back into filming a little bit late in 2026, and there are so many January videos I want to do, so it may be that I do 3 videos next week and the week after, in order to like catch up all of the January New Year content. I have, you know, favourite books of the year to film and reading goals and all of that stuff. But for now, I thought I would do my December wrap up and tell you what I read in December. Now, I read an awful lot in December because of my TBR advent calendar. I read 29 books, which is definitely the most I've ever read in 1 month. A lot of those books were very short, but still, that is quite a lot of reading. Obviously, I was reviewing the books I was reading for the TBR advent calendar day by day, so I'm not going to go through them all. Well, I am going to go through them all here, but I'm not going to talk about them in detail. I'm not going to review them really in this video, but if you want to find out more about the books I read for the TBR advent calendar, I will leave the playlist down below with all of the reviews. And then I will also talk about the books that I read that weren't for that. I thought I'd also do a very quick goals check-in, which I was doing for all my wrap-ups in 2025. I'm not sure whether or not I'll keep doing that in 2026, but of my sort of main goals for 2025, I did read an Anthony Trollope book in December. I also read 1 book from my long-term TBR, which was not enough, but you know, that's fine. We'll talk about that in my goals reflections. And then in terms of my goal to read more internationally, I read from 11 countries in December: the UK, Sweden, Germany, Norway, North Macedonia, Japan, Senegal, France, Australia, Zimbabwe, and the US. And I also read 8 books in translation, which is exciting. So first, I'm going to very briefly go through the books I read for the TBR advent calendar. Instead of going through them in the order that I read them in, I'm going to go through them in year order, in chronological order. So I did read quite a few classics for the TBR advent calendar, which was nice. The earliest book I read was Varney the Vampire by James Malcolm Ryder, a penny dreadful I've been reading over the last 2 years, and I finished it off in a day of my TBR advent calendar, though obviously I didn't read this all in one day because it is huge, but I'm glad that I finally finished this, and yeah, if you want to know more about my thoughts on Varney the Vampire, I'll leave that video down below. I also read The Ring and the Rose by William Makepeace Thackeray from 1854, which is a Christmas fairy story novella, which was quite fun, and that's probably enough of a review considering I did a separate review of it. I also read A Beleaguered City by Margaret Oliphant from 1879, a supernatural ghost story by Margaret Oliphant. I read a poetry collection by Algernon Charles Swinburne, which was fine, but not great. I also read The Trumpet-Major by Thomas Hardy from 1880 for General Librarian's Thomas Hardy read-along. Listened to this in an audiobook, really enjoyed it. Thomas Hardy is such a wonderful author. I also read The Christmas Hirelings by Mary Elizabeth Braddon from 1894, a delightful Christmas novella. This was a reread for me. I read it last Christmas. I think I'm going to read it every Christmas. It's just amazing. Moving into the 20th century, I read 2nd April by Edna St. Vincent Millay, a really powerful short story collection. I then read After the Funeral by Agatha Christie from 1953. I listened to this in an audiobook. It was the next Poirot book. Me and my husband Nick have been listening to Agatha Christie's Poirot books in order. Really enjoyed this one. Not like absolute top tier, but probably like a 4-star Agatha Christie, I would say. I also read The Man Who Planted Trees by Giono, translated from the French by Barbara Bray. This is a really intriguing little 1950s classic that I would highly recommend. I also read Grave of the Fireflies by Akiyuki Nosaka, translated from the Japanese by Ginny Tapley Takemori. This is an incredibly powerful, very raw and difficult short story from the 1960s, set during Japan in the Second World War. It's really worth a read, but it's very tough, and I think it's worth knowing that going into it. Talking of tough reads, I also read Reunion by Fred Uhlman, which is an amazing novel from the 1970s by a German author who later moved to the UK. I am actually going to talk about Reunion properly because this was probably my favourite book of the month, one of my favourite books of the year. Reunion is a coming-of-age story about 2 boys who are teenagers, growing up in Germany in the 1930s. The narrator is Jewish, his friend is not, and it's about how the rise of the Nazi Party drives a wedge between them and affects their lives, and it's just incredible. I don't think I have cried this much in a book for a really long time, but also it's just amazing. Like, everyone should read this book immediately. That's all I have to say. I also read The Grey King by Susan Cooper, a children's classic from the 1970s, which is the fourth book in a series. Part of the Dark is Rising series. Really enjoyed that one. I also read So Long a Letter by Mariama Ba, translated from the French by Modupé Bodé-Thomas. This is a feminist Senegalese novel written in the form of a letter, where one woman who has recently been widowed but had been estranged from her husband is writing to her friend who is divorced, talking about marriage and gender and power dynamics and social changes in Senegal in the second half of the 20th century. I thought I would talk about this one a little bit more because I thought this was really, really great. A really powerful, intriguing read, and yeah, well worth your time. That was from the 1970s. Did I say that? I can't remember. Anyway, it's fine. I have so many books to get through. Another book I read from the 1970s is The Death of Jim Loney by James Welsh. This is a really powerful American classic by a Native American author writing about the experiences of Native Americans in the 20th century, with amazing characterization and a real sense of mounting chaos. I don't know, I just thought this was great. I also read Suspicion by Seicho Matsumoto, translated from the Japanese by Jessie Kirkwood. This is a Japanese 20th century thriller that is well worth your time and told in a really interesting way. Okay, and now into the 21st century, I read Mamo by Sas Milledge, a really beautiful graphic novel about two young girls trying to stop magical things damaging their village. Is great. I also read Ti Amo by Hanne Ostervik, translated from the Norwegian by Martin Aitken. This is a semi-autobiographical novel about a woman whose husband is dying and about her experiences caring for him in the last few weeks and months of his life. I also read Orbital by Samantha Harvey, which was another favourite of the month, so let's spend a tiny bit more time on this. This is a really fascinating literary novel about a group of astronauts who are orbiting Earth and looking at it and reflecting on things. It's very literary. It's much more literary than my usual taste, and it's very sort of philosophical and plotless, and I just thought it was absolutely exquisite, exquisitely written, exquisitely formed, amazing characterization, amazing observations. I tabbed it. I can't remember the last time I felt moved to tab a work of fiction because I just wanted to keep the lines in my head forever. It was just great. I loved it so much. I also read The Moon at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke, which is a really beautifully illustrated short story, kind of fairy tale, which I just, really, really enjoyed. I've picked a really boring page to open. Here we go. That's better. I also read The Summer Without You by Peter Andonovsky, translated by Christina E. Kramer. This is a North Macedonian novel about a couple who are sort of haunted by this man they were both kind of in love with at university, and it's just really odd, but really great. Then I also read The Austen Christmas Murders by Jessica Bull. This is a festive mystery where Jane Austen is the sleuth, and it's just excellent fun. I love this series very, very much. Then I also read Shimiso by Brian Chikwava, which is a literary coming-of-age story about a young woman who has moved from Zimbabwe to Brighton. This is probably a little bit too literary for my taste, but I thought it was a really interesting novel. Then I also read Wild Boar by Hannah Lutz, the story of various people who are drawn together in a particular forest landscape in Sweden. This is also a little bit too literary for me, but it was a really interesting read. I was just trying to count all my books, and I just could not for the life of me work out what book I had missed out, but I've got it now. Final book that I spoke about in a TBR Advent Calendar video, though I didn't actually finish it in that video, but hey, that was Beneath a Midwinter Moon, which is a short story collection by various authors consisting of various festive stories, all of which are historical fiction taking place at different points in time. This was the pick for my Patreon Historical Fiction Book Club for December, and it was a mixed bag. I feel like there were some stories I enjoyed, there were some stories I really didn't enjoy. Overall, there probably weren't that many standout stories for me. Okay, so that's the TBR Advent Calendar. And then there were 5 books I read in December that weren't for the TBR Advent Calendar that I will quickly talk about. So one was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which actually I do think I mentioned in a TBR Advent Calendar video alongside something else. But anyway, I reread A Christmas Carol because I love A Christmas Carol. I reread A Christmas Carol most Christmases. Charles Dickens is great. What more do I have to say about A Christmas Carol? I've made a lot of videos about it in the past, so I'll leave some link down below. I think it's a wonderful festive story that means a lot to me, and I find really powerful and really fun and just delightful, and just like Dickens being thoroughly Dickensian, and it's great. So love that a lot. And I also finished off Bleak House, which I had started in November. I was hosting a read along of this over November and December. I am going to make a separate video about this. Well, I have already filmed it. I filmed like a vlog part by part as I was going through, but I haven't edited that yet. So that'll be up maybe later this week, maybe next week, probably next week. I think it'll be up next week. And yeah, I will talk more about Bleak House there, but I have read this book many times before. It's a real favourite of mine. I love Charles Dickens, obviously, as I just said, and Bleak House is an incredible novel that is so complex and deep, and it's such a big, chunky novel with so many plots and characters. So every time I read it, I kind of end up focusing on a different thing or thinking about a different element. It's about all these various characters who are kind of drawn together by this court case, this disputed will, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, and it's just wonderful. I think it's Dickens's social criticism at its best. There's a character called Joe, and this time, for some reason, Joe was just like the character I kept focusing on. He's an impoverished young boy living on the streets, who just has been entirely forgotten and neglected and let down by the society he lives in. And I just think Joe as a character and his story and the way Dickens uses him for social criticism, I just think it's astoundingly well done. And there were lots of other things that I was thinking about on this reread, but for some reason Joe was the character that really stood out for me this time. And yeah, I just think Bleak House is incredible, and I'd highly recommend it. It's a long book, but it's so worth your time. And then sticking on Victorian literature, I also read, as I said earlier, an Anthony Trollope book in December, and that was Castle Richmond. I started this in November, finished off in December, and just loved it. I mean, I always love Anthony Trollope. I think he's a wonderful writer, but Castle Richmond is a really fascinating one. So this book is set in Ireland during the Irish famine, and I feel like the way the famine is written about is fascinating, really tough. Like, there are some of the most distressing, upsetting scenes I've ever encountered in, I was about to say in an Anthony Trollope novel, but to be honest, in any Victorian novel, are in Castle Richmond. The main plot of Castle Richmond doesn't focus on the famine, though that is a kind of constant background throughout the book. But the main plot focuses on two upper-class families living in Ireland, a countess and her two children, and a baronet and his family. And we know from the beginning that the baronet has a secret. He has a secret trouble that is slowly driving him mad. And the question, of course, is at first, what is that secret, which you end up knowing quite early on, and then what on earth are they going to do about it? And everything goes on from there. Anthony Trollope is, I think, an incredible writer. And I think his characterization is just incredible. And some of the characters in Castle Richmond were just so well done. The Countess of Desmond was a real highlight for me because she's a really complex character, and I feel like Anthony Trollope is very good at creating these sort of dislikable, very flawed characters that you feel for, and she was definitely one of them. And I just thought it was great. I just thought it was so good. Anthony Trollope is one of those writers where whenever I pick up a book by Anthony Trollope, I'm like, oh, why isn't everything I read Anthony Trollope? I should just read Anthony Trollope all the time. And obviously that's not the case, and I do want more variation in my reading, but I just love Anthony Trollope. What more do I have to say? He's great. I now have 3 books by Anthony Trollope left to read before I finish all of his books. So I haven't quite managed to finish them all 47 of them, by the end of 2025, but I only have 3 left, and I'm halfway through one now. So yeah, I'm nearly there. It's very exciting. Then I also finished off reading the Persephone book of short stories, which I had started reading at the beginning of 2025, and then put down for a while and then picked up again. It's a short story anthology by various different writers, mostly 20th century. I think probably all 20th century, actually. Yes, they're all 20th century, but they kind of span throughout the 20th century. And there's a lot of amazing stories in here. I love this collection. I thought it was such a strong collection, really well curated. Obviously, with every anthology, there's some stories you love more than others, but in general, this was very strong. And there were some incredible stories. Which were my favourites? Do I remember? There's one particular that actually I didn't read in December. I read ages ago, but I just keep thinking about, and that is Holiday Group by Delafield. It's just an incredible story about gender dynamics in the early 20th century. And yeah, in general, I just thought this was a really incredible collection, very well curated, full of fantastic stories. I would really, really recommend it. There's definitely a few authors in here I'm going to be looking out for more from in the future. And then finally, my final book of 2025 was The 12 Days of Christmas by Susan Stokes Chapman. So this is a interconnected short story collection which came out in September. I have a proof copy here actually, but I ended up saving it for Christmas. And this was so fun to read like during the 12 days of Christmas, because it is, like I said, an interconnected short story collection, work of historical fiction set in the Regency period, and each story is inspired by a verse of the 12 days of Christmas. You know, on the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a partridge in a pear tree, and the first story is about a elderly woman called Miss Partridge who has to climb a pear tree at some point. It's just really fun. It is set in 1816 in a small town, and we follow various people in this small town, many of whom are kind of connected to sort of the big house of the town. Following the main family, the Pepins, but we're also following many of their guests, many of their servants. There's a very like upstairs, downstairs feel as you move between the servants' hall and the drawing room. You get a sort of separate, complete story in each tale, but also in each tale you will encounter some of the characters from previous stories, and their stories will be deepened and furthered. And then in a way, some characters, the endings of their story don't take place in their story, but in a later story. And it's just, oh, it's so good. It's so well woven, so wonderfully intertwined. I love interconnected short story collections, or novels told in the form of short stories, however you want to describe that form. I love them, and I used to read a lot of them. I actually wrote one when I was doing my creative writing MA a good decade ago now. My dissertation project was an interconnected short story collection. And because I was writing one, I read a lot of them in my early 20s. And I don't actually think I've read one for quite a few years. And I love it as a form. I think it's a really clever, fun form where you can do all kinds of like clever things with storytelling. And I just haven't read one for ages. And reading this, I was like, oh yeah, this is just like one of the best forms of books. I just love a interconnected short story collection where, yeah, each story stands on its own but also builds on the previous stories and relates back to the previous stories. And I just thought this was done superbly. It's so well woven and it's so fun, and it's a real like lovely mix between cozy, comforting, festive stuff and darker themes. It's set in 1816, and there's quite a lot about the Napoleonic Wars and the influence that it's had on many of these characters and how they are living with the legacy and trauma of the past few years. I thought this was really powerful, really well done, and just, yeah, absolutely worth your time. It is very Christmassy, so maybe save it till next Christmas, but I highly recommend it. It was great. Okay, those are the things that I read in December. Many, many things. I hope this hasn't been too long a video, because although there were a lot of books to talk about, I obviously went through the TBR Advent Calendar ones very speedily, I hope. But you know, we'll see. Anyway, that's all for now. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, what your favourite book of December was. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.